How about this array of seafood artifacts we have put out on display for you and from our Food Museum collection? We're going to be doing a series of shows here on our YouTube channel about seafood, and I've enjoyed pulling these out of storage and learning a lot about seafood that we didn't know and sharing it with you. So let's look at this. Look at this. Here's some of the seafood that we're going to be featuring. Humans have been processing fish since Neolithic times. Here's the 16th century fish stall showing many traditional fish products. Look at that array. So this is a mosaic in Pompeii. It was discovered in Pompeii with showing all the seafood that those early Italians were eating. Here's Native Americans, different ways of catching the fish, spearing them and netting them, all that. See the turtles also. Look at this array. Whoops, I went the wrong way. Here's a 4th century mosaic showing again catching fish, spearing them. Here's a ancient pottery, prehistoric pottery, 300 AD from Peru, fishermen. This is a Ming porcelain pot with a carp. Here's another one of those mosaics, fishing with and netting them. Fishing with nets. This is a 14th century artifact. This is a picture of seafood off the Newfoundland coast, an artistic rendition. Dating back 125,000 years, the Red Sea coast. Neanderthals were cooking shellfish in Italy around 110,000 years. These are all archaeological sites and evidence. Ancient Egyptians were some of the first to practice aquaculture. Lobster, some of these fish were considered trash fish. They were so common, and then the whole industrialization and refrigeration allowed for distribution away from the sea coasts and turned seafood into almost a common everyday thing. Sometimes now we're doing too much overfishing, and that's the importance of aquaculture. This is the Chinese were some of the earliest into aquaculture. This is an AI rendering of the ancient to the modern. Ice, of course, made possible the preservation of seafood and distribution of it. Here's marine culture off of Hong Kong. Here's carp, one of the dominant fishes in freshwater aquaculture, and of course tilapia, very useful in aquaculture. This, I think, is I've forgotten where this is, but look at the size of this marine culture, aquaculture. Not sure where that is. Might be Spain. So there's evidence in cuneiform tablets that the Sumerians were some of the first people to isolate fish and to grow them in tanks. You can see here during seasonal flooding, they would get the fish to come in, and then they would close it off, and they could preserve them. Throughout medieval Europe, the monasteries developed ponds, fish ponds, so they could have fresh fish and cultivate them. Here's an enormous abalone farm. Look at this. So here's a bit of history of artificial propagation and hatchery techniques developed by the Japanese and others. This is one of my favorites. This is the Great Fish Market, painted by Jan Bruegel the Elder. This is 16th century. something like that. Look at the industry. So here are the fishing boats coming in, or still out there fishing and landing the fish and processing, getting ready to salt them or move them to the market stalls. And here's everybody gathered. Just, I don't know how many people he depicted in this picture, but he was a master at this sort of thing. Here's a fish market that were on barges along the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Fresh fish market, still there. Here's a painting of a fish market in France. I love this one. This is a London, I think, fishmonger. Look at the array of fish he has. She's trying to decide. Look at the dog with her. This is like a 1930s menu. This is just part of the menu. It shows the fish specials and the regulars, oysters, clams, and seafood, and the prices. This would be not an uncommon menu at some of the big restaurants in some of the big cities. Here's a 1910 advertisement for these fish companies, wholesale fish companies, fish oils, fishing outfits, pickled fish, and all that. And so then the benefits of good fisheries management, the pros and cons, you can see them here. So yeah, the cons are overfishing and depletion, bycatch. You catch things that you don't want, you just throw them away. Habitat destruction, pollution and disease, and food insecurity as a result. The pros are global food supply steady, economic growth and development, employment for people, resource efficiency. That's an important. Fish farming, responsibly managed fishing requires significantly less feed and fresh water per kilogram of protein produced than land-based livestock. And then the cultural significance, it keeps this fish available for people who have it culturally important in their heritage. So here's a poster that shows all of that, encapsulates it. Look at this sturgeon farm under the big grow lights. Here it shows the growth of marine culture since 2000 to 2023. You see it just continues to increase for most everything for seafood. China and Asia, East Asia and India are still the leaders in aquaculture, farm fish production. You can see that map. And the U.S. imports a lot of fish from aquaculture farms, Indonesia, for instance, shrimp and all that sort of thing. So yeah, over 90% of wild fish stocks are maxed out, fished over or overfished. So it's so important that we're producing this important food resource efficiently, economically, and safely. So important thing about fish in the old days before refrigeration is you had to salt them and you had to dry them. So here's a scene in Amsterdam, early 17th century. The ships docked and they had to quickly get the fish salted and dried in these buildings. Here's a smaller operation, a family who is salted, and they're drying their catch on that overhang there. So yeah, preservation draws out moisture, prevents bacterial growth, involves splitting the fish, coating them with heavily with food-grade salt for 24 to 48 hours, washing away the excess salt, and air drying them. Here's some various scenes. Women drying fish in North Africa, I think. No, West Africa. And then here's some more scenes of drying fish in the markets. Stockfish being dried in Iceland. And platforms called fish flakes were cod dry in the sun before being packed in salt. So in this case, they would dry them first and then pack them in salt. Here's a salt fish dip in Jakarta, drying salt in France and other places. Remains of a Roman fish salting plant. Look at that. So Egyptians, here's a scene of Egyptians bringing fish and splitting them for salting. There's a medieval smokehouse in Belgium. This village was uncovered and explored archaeologically and then set up as a sort of a living historic seaport and farm. This is an ice house, traditional ice house used to preserve fish in Findhorn. I'm not sure exactly, that may be Sweden. Here's ice delivering by boat, loading blocks of factory-made ice for on board a ship, and other ice scenes. So stockfish, for instance, look at this. Stockfish storage house are all been dried. Unsalted fish, especially cod, dried by cold air and wind on wooden racks. You can see them there. In Norway, the drying of food is the world's oldest known preservation method, and dried fish is a storage life of several years. It's a cheap, effective method in suitable climates. And look at this scene. This is the scene in Norway of this fishing village that was specialized in Loften. Forgot the name of it, but it's a famous stockfish port producing this. So fish sauce. This is another way of preserving fish. Concentrated liquid condiment from fermented fish and sea salt, revered for its deep umami, savory flavor, and it's a very important source of preserving seafood. Look at this, the whole scene. Ancient roots, ancient Vietnam and the Mekong Delta. Fish sauce, the Vietnamese are still famous for their fish sauce, and they have a global market. Look at the fermentation pots. So history of fish sauce. And the Romans, their fish sauce was called garum, salty sauce made from fish, had a strong odor, and they would preserve it in these and transport it in these big clay pots. This is a mosaic showing it, the importance of it. Here's so there's an explanation of it. Popular during the Roman Empire's times, and then in East Asia, fermented fish and soy were utilized as early as 2,300 years ago. Here it shows the process of making the fish sauce, and then they store it in these big barrels. So you need small, oily fish like anchovies, sardines, and plenty of sea salt, and you mix them all up, let them ferment. So yeah, Vietnamese fish sauce. Here's a traditional warehouse for them. Look at that. That's one of the old pots that they did, and here's the more modern. Here's the jars. Big part of the Vietnamese culture. And fish soups, some of the more famous fish soups in the world. Chowder, thick soup, cream and milk, seafood and vegetables. Here's a type of soup popular in Russia. Bisque is a French, smooth, creamy, highly seasoned soup of French origin, with strained broth and crustaceans, langoustine, shrimp. This is a Chilean fish soup, traditional. Here's one, chopino, which is a favorite of ours, and a favorite of mine, fish stew from San Francisco. We're gonna do a whole show about chopino, Italian American. They would make these this fish stew right on the fishing boats. And this is Myanmar, national dish of Myanmar, mohinjo, I guess, fish soup made with rice noodles. This is what people in Myanmar or Burma would have for breakfast. Look at that. And there were lots of itinerant people selling this in the streets as people went to work. Turmeric, fish sauce, boiled eggs as a whole meal, very, very popular traditional Burmese breakfast. Seafood soup. Here's a Brazilian seafood stew with tomatoes and garlic and lime and coriander. Yeah, so this is more about the chopino. So yeah, these fishermen they have their catch, and they would making the seafood soup right on the deck, and that became popular, and then they started selling it off in the wharf to people. Originally, it was just for the fishermen's lunch or dinner. These hundreds of fishermen who came from the Liguria region of Italy into California, port city of Genoa, and they brought their fishing skills. There was a communal pot. Fishermen returned to the docks empty-handed. They would walk down the wharf with a bucket or pot, and those who were a little more fortunate would share some things in. Chopino and bouillabaisse. Wow, this is a famous Provençal fish stew or soup. Features lots of fish, shellfish, vegetables, very flavorful broth, seasoned with saffron, which is important, garlic and fennel. And you start with the broth, a bowl of broth, and you put the bread in, and then you put the a fish spread on there, and then you start putting the fish. You lay the various pieces of fish into the broth, and then you eat it. We're going to do more about that later. Oh, not later. We're going to do it now. This is from our book, Gastronomy, Food Museums and Heritage Sites of France. And we enjoyed meeting this chef, Dede Del Monte, and down in the Provence section, and he specialized in bouillabaisse. And you can see there he's preparing it, and he would prepare it traditionally and serve it in a hunk of cork bark, which we ended up owning, bringing back. So yeah, it's just one of our original artifacts. And then during the wars, fish became fighting food. These are posters that are showing that the America's fishing fleet and fishermen were an important part of the victory. And then fish were a vital source of food during agricultural shortages. Of fish made up for some of those shortages. So here's these celebrating the fishing industry. History of British Fishes. This is a book first by William Yarrell, and 2-volume set. Here he is. He was a British. He was a bookshop owner, but he was really interested in ichthyology, the study of fish, and he did this whole 2 volumes showing all of the British fish and seafood. And then the history of the fishes of the British Isles was a 4-volume collection by Jonathan Couch from Cornwall section, and he would commission fishermen to bring him various fish that they were either that they caught that they weren't planning to eat, but so he ended up having this huge collection that he would go down to the wharf and do drawings and study the fish and wrote about it. His work covers the historical and scientific classification of fish families in the British Isles. Very important work. And our Food Museum library contains many of the original prints from that collection, and they're just beautifully, I think they're hand painted and then engravings. Yeah, look at this. We must have 50 of these easily. It's a real prized part of our collection. Look at that thrasher there. Yeah, these were hand-colored from the author's own watercolors, freshly caught specimens. 1860 to 1865, he published those 4 volumes. So yeah, just a little bit more about him. Jonathan Couch, he was a doctor, self-taught naturalist in Cornwall. Heavily considered accurate, colored engravings derived directly from his personal artwork. It remains a foundational document in the field of 19th century ichthyology, representing a major leap forward in how fish were documented and visualized. And it says, the review of this is a storehouse of information carefully collected and sifted as to the habits of fishes, and in many cases the illustrations give unique representations of the vivid natural colors of fishes while yet alive and immediately after death. So yeah, these fishermen he commissioned would bring these fish in, even if they weren't planning to use them, consumption and sell. And he would then document them as they were freshly caught and preserved. And this is a great organization, the International Commission of the History of Oceanography. They do all sorts of research. They link scholars, writers, and teachers interested in the history of marine science, broadly defined, and they link up science, medicine, history of science, technology, with chefs and cooks and people interested in, and they've been doing a bunch of publishing. Also, there's a whole history of abalone and sea nomads, so a really important organization that I'm happy to know about. So we're the Global Food Heritage Center, and so we're focused on heritage sites of all kinds, and especially seafood heritage sites. In this case, here's the Fulton Fish Market, a whole book about the history of this important market in New York City, and other. There are fish trails, fish history trails. This one's in Rhode Island and has a whole series of signs, and you can walk along this waterfront and learn about the history of Rhode Island fisheries. So, yeah, one of the earliest fishing communities almost completely derived, their civilization devised on seafood. One of the most unusual communities in history was the Calusa in southwest Florida. And they had developed all these techniques for catching and then farming fish. And they had almost an entire civilization based on not agriculture, not farming, but on fish and seafood. They had all these processing racks. They developed all these palmetto net systems, canals, and dugout canoes. So, and a lot of this has been preserved. This was all pre-Spanish, and then the Spanish came along and kind of disrupted their culture, and they went away. But look at these images, pictures drawn of what they think the Calusa fish processing was about. Here, there's a whole exhibit down in South Florida about showing the culture of these people. They had massive seafood surpluses which they traded. They had an intricate trade system. They've discovered that it was all the capital of this. They had never had outposts all along the South Florida coast. They considered their capital was now Mound Key, which is off of Cape Coral and Fort Myers in southwest Florida, and shows some of the settlements. So Mound Key is now a state park. It's been preserved. This was considered their capital, and you get there by boat, and then you can walk around, you can fish, and you can sightsee. It's a 125-acre island. This is a very important food heritage site, seafood heritage site. And then here's a book. Lots of books on. So much publishing has gone on about the history of seafood, individual seafood products, and the communities. This is a story of a Maine fishing community. And here's a historic Hastings, UK, in Sussex, and they're preserving their whole story of their fishing community. And they have these fish drying houses there. We spent some time there. So all of these things have been preserved, and we're very happy to call attention to them. Cortez Village in Florida off of Bradenton, a place very familiar to us. Gloucester, Mass, another famous seafood heritage, but a very active still. Massachusetts, they have this famous seafarer, they that go down in the ships to the sea in ships. And then here's this place in Newfoundland, Fogo Island. Very important seafood community, mix of Irish and English cultural heritage, traditional cod fishing infrastructure. So a lot of these places have been preserved. This one is United Kingdom. This is Staith's. Look at that. Look at that. They would bring the boats down in the community. Look at that little tiny harbor they have. One of England's largest fishing ports. North Yorkshire village features steep, winding alleyways, rainbow-colored cottages, rich legacy of inshore cod and herring fishing. And then here's that village in Walraverskid. That's the name. I'm not pronouncing it very well. But they uncovered this site, and then they've restored it as kind of a historic working seafood village. And then this is Huanchaco in Peru, North Peru coast, where they've been fishing for forever in these reed watercraft, torturas. Local fishermen have been using this for thousands of years. This system, and there's the system of their pots and their way they fished. So historic seafood communities. Here's one in Vietnam. Here's one in Finland. Port Isaac. Another one in Cornwall. This one's in Michigan. Look at that. And then another one in Cornwall. And then Tayo. Historic fishing village, still active on Lantau Island in Hong Kong, known as the Venice of the East, celebrated for its traditional waterways. You can see in the still houses. We spent some time there. It was an extraordinary experience off of this large inlet. And this is one of their shrimp pastes. Here's the traditional way of making it. This is one of their products in this historic fishing village. And another product is these egg yolks. So the Tayo salted egg yolk, famous culinary delicacy from the fishing village, made using an age-old fisherman's method. Egg yolks are cured in salt and sun-dried in the sea air until they harden into vibrant orange, rich gems. They use the viscous whites of duck eggs to coat and strengthen their hemp fishing nets, and which left them with an abundance of leftover yolks. So this is how they preserve the yolks. That's all for now. We're going to be doing a lot more, showing our artifacts and on the individual slideshows for each of these subjects. Look at this little guy here, little balanced toy. All right, so we'll see you next time. Enjoy your seafood.